Hello and welcome to the Stormont Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics of Stormont and inside policymaking for Northern Ireland. I'm David McCann, and also on the podcast are Tim Kearns, former Special Advisor to First Minister Peter Robinson and Head of Policy for the DUP. Hello, Tim.
Hi, David.
And we also have Michael McKernan, former Special Advisor to the SDLP. He worked in the executive from 2007 to 2016. Hello, Michael.
Hello, David. Hello, Tim.
Hey, on the podcast today, we will reflect on 1 year of Gavin Robinson as DUP leader. In this episode, you're going to be getting two former DUP SPADs for the price of one. We will be joined by another former DUP special advisor who will speak to us about his column on this topic this week in the Irish News. Then we will examine the Trump tariffs. How will they impact Northern Ireland, and what, if anything, can the executive do about it? You can watch it all on YouTube. Search for Stormont Sources, where we will upload clips and full episodes for you to enjoy. Head to YouTube, subscribe to our channel there for videos and updates. You can also follow us on X, watch clips on TikTok, Instagram, and subscribe to our mailing list at stormontsources.com. Now, you can also get in touch with us on WhatsApp, 0333 404 6507. That number again is 0333 404 6507. Make sure you use the word Stormont. You can comment or critique what you're listening to as the podcast is going on. Also get in touch with us. hello@stormontsources.com for the email. Now, first up today, we are looking at 1 year, hard to believe it's been a year, of Gavin Robinson as the leader of the DUP. Gavin became the leader at the end of March last year following Jeffrey Donaldson's resignation. And this week, we're joined by another former DUP Special Advisor, Lee Reynolds. He was Special Advisor to former First Minister, Arlene Foster. He also succeeded Tim as the Head of Policy for the Democratic Unionist Party. And in the Irish News this week, he has been reflecting on Gavin's first year as the leader of the party. He's also been looking at what has gone well, but also what he needs to improve on. Lee, you're very welcome to Stormont Sources.
Thank you.
Lee, just wanted to ask, you have been reflecting, obviously, on 1 year. You've noted some of the achievements, but I want to focus on where you think he needs to improve. So you referenced, I know this is something close to your heart, because, of course, one of your many political jobs was head of the Vote Leave campaign in Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. You talked about the Irish Sea border and about the issues that you think are not going away. So how do you think Gavin Robinson has dealt with that so far? And what in particular does he need to do to resolve that issue?
He took over the leadership with a problem of Jeffrey's overselling, which he has acknowledged and admitted. The way I would describe it is, Windsor Framework gained some things, safeguarding the union gained some things. Unfortunately, as a tactic, it had been boycotting the Assembly had been wrung dry of anything more it was going to give, and there were certainly no prospects that waiting for Labour would deliver anything more or different. So the decision had to be taken, and the decision was taken to go back in. Now, I think there was a bit of a hope or expectation of there'll be anger, but this will fade away, and in a few years, will it be an issue? Well, I think there's two problems with that. One, the nature of it. It doesn't go away. It keeps coming up. And as we have seen in the last few weeks, it finds new ways of coming up that weren't necessarily broadly expected before now. And the fundamental problem is it is a system which is proving itself to be essentially much more cost than any benefit that can be identified, and it's getting increasingly difficult to identify the benefits. So I think it's a case of it has to be dealt with. It has to be worked through. It's not. Now, I would say this: they have started engaging more with the issue and trying to push the issue more, which I think they have to do. There's also the thing of it, as it's not fading away, they have to be seen to be doing what is, well, not only what is right, but what is needed. And then I think they need to realise that, I've had a number of discussions and with different shades of unionism. TUVers always want to bring it back to the sea border because that's their one big issue. So pretending it doesn't exist isn't going to be an option.
But Lee, it's part of the...
Equally, it can't be the only thing the DUP is trying to deal with. You know, it
No,
can't
no,
turn itself into
I
one issue.
understand, but just on that, we're not going to focus on the sea border
Uh-huh.
for the entire piece because I know you mentioned other issues, but just something on that is the big problem for the DP on this not that they don't have control of the policy outcomes of this, and that was always going to be the problem for the DP. This essentially is a negotiation between the European Union and the UK government, and if you listen to Hilary Benn in the House of Commons this week, I mean, this is a resolved issue as far as the European Union are concerned, and as far as the British government are concerned. So I mean, does he not run the risk if he tries to engage with us about reopening a scab that he maybe can't actually resolve?
Well, it's not resolved. There are more things coming down the pipeline, particularly later this year, which have the potential to cause disruption. Also, as we have seen over the last couple of weeks, here is the new issue of the American tariffs and what's going to happen and where is it going to happen. And basically, settled will or not, that means that new issue has to come up. And even we've seen it recently where the EU has then went, AI should be covered by this. Now, I personally considered AI a service, but apparently it's a good, and they are now requesting it be covered. So it doesn't go away. It isn't settled. There will be new issues come up. And I think Labour is making a fundamental mistake. They're trying to be nice to the EU, thinking being nice to the EU will make the EU generous. EU doesn't work like that. The EU sits there and go, if you want this, you have to give us 5 things. And they just sit there until they get the 5 things. And, that's how you want to negotiate with them. Good luck, because that's the way it's going to be.
Yeah, it seems to me, Lee, that all of this really goes back to the decision to go all in on Brexit in 2016. And it seems that it always felt to me like it was a very odd decision on Arlene Foster's part because she was really at the height of her powers at that time coming up to the referendum, and she'd just come in as leader. And the first decision she made was to back Brexit. And I wonder, obviously, in your position as Vote Leave and obviously in advising Arlene, I mean, for full disclosure, I voted Remain, and we've debated this many times. Lee, my view was that the unionists should not go all in on this. The disaster that's happened was reasonably foreseeable. I didn't think it would be quite this bad, but I did think there would be an Irish sea border, there would be problems. So it was better the devil you know, and we obviously disagreed on that. But it did seem to me to be odd that Arlene Foster at that time would go so hard in on Brexit and be almost, the cheerleaders for Brexit, the wraparounds and English newspapers and all of that. Do you think if you could go back to that point in time, that the advice to Arlene would be different? It would be maybe just don't go quite all in on this.
Well, that's a bit of a misrepresentation of the DUP position. And if you looked at the manifesto prior to the announcement of the EU referendum, the DUP position was we're going to wait and see until Cameron comes back with his negotiation package. So we had created the space not to back Leave, if we so chose. But he came back with such a paltry offering that basically it wasn't a credible option then. So the DUP had created space for itself, but the failure of Cameron basically nullified that space. There was also a broader consideration that this was an opportunity for the DUP to build relationships with the political mainstream in the UK. And it did to some degree. But the support, the sort of DUP going more all in on Brexit became much more with the process of Brexit itself. First, the confidence supply position, and then when essentially it was decided, it was officially Northern Ireland was picked as the EU's victim.
But it almost seems to me like there's a succession of fumbles. I think it was a fumble to go all in on the referendum. I think the Theresa May election was fumbled because the DUP was a bit of hokey cokey. They weren't quite in, they weren't quite out. A confidence and supply day that delivered a bit of money that. But there's lots of good things delivered with that cash. I don't think there's nothing that anybody could touch, nothing that anybody could really see. And I think that was a fumble. And then I think obviously, leading into, how the public inquiry and all of those things were handled, it was a series of fumbles. So do you think that Arlene Foster's 10 years left Gavin in a difficult position? And I suppose if we think that it has, then how does he row out of that? How does he row back what those series of fumbles that potentially she made?
Well, I would come to Arlene's defence on a number of things. Again, look at the detail of confidence and supply. the way it was designed was, you remember, a 2-year deal, and then the relationship was to be reviewed after 2 years. It was essentially, we're new partners, we have historical grounds for not particularly trusting each other, so we will tread carefully. Essentially, the way it was designed of, if this went well, that after 2 years, the relationship could have deepened, the relationship could have stayed as it was for the remainder of the term, or it could be, you know what, this hasn't worked out, we will now take a step back. So options were built into the deal. Now, we never got to that 2 year, essentially, to get it, but that's what, that sort of thing was designed in the deal. There's also this sort of myth that's developed that if we'd went all in and got a position in the cabinet, then we had known of all these things, blah, blah, blah. Theresa May and her negotiating team weren't telling the cabinet. So being on the cabinet was not an insight to
But what
what
about a
was going
position
on.
on the negotiating team? Surely they could have asked for that.
This is where you get into, well, I'll put it this way, the civil service said that they couldn't even have a special advisor position based on the deal. So and this was, I think it was, I was going to name the official who I think made that decision, but I'm not 100% sure, so I won't. So it is now. I would also introduce one interesting caveat, that the Home Civil Service said that was impossible for the DUP to have that position, to engage with government and help those sort of things. But whenever it came to the Plaid Cymru relationship in Wales, they said it was okay, which I find an interesting contradictory decision-making process in in very similar circumstances, because they've got a number of SPADs, even though they haven't formally joined the Welsh government. This is the thing, but this thing, the Department of EU Exit didn't even really know what was going on. So even if the minister didn't know. So even if you were working with the minister, how could they really keep you abreast? A friend of mine from the Leave campaign ended up as special advisor. He's written articles where he's basically implied that key members of the negotiating team told lies to ministers. So this, I don't think there's any of the mechanism we can now imagine were basically going to save us from what was a very tiny core group who had no compunction in lying to pretty much everybody. I don't think there was a protection for that. And also, I think if we had gone into the cabinet, then things would have came to a head much quicker. And we do have to remember the circumstances of, there was the existential threat to the UK state of Jeremy Corbyn. And that was the thing. What I would say overall was that what looked like a golden opportunity was actually a golden cage. The reason we had influence was the reason why nothing could get done. The Tory government of that time could agree on nothing but a budget. There's no significant legislation coming through that period at all. Essentially, once you got 6 or 7 Tories to walk off, nothing was happening. And so that was essentially, we made a deal with the Conservative Party. We were in a party we were in a relationship with a party that in those 2 years had ceased to exist. It was essentially 3 warring factions. It wasn't a functioning party. And that was, and that was,
well, I think there's no doubt it was a tough hand, Lee. But if you look at the position that Arlene inherited when Peter left in the end of 2015, and the position that Gavin inherited then just a year ago, I mean, the party is in a much weaker position. So Arlene's leadership and Jeffrey's leadership clearly weakened the party. So whatever we say about there might have been this and we might have had bad hands and there might have been golden cages, that there's little or no doubt that the party that Peter left and the party that Gavin has inherited are in vastly different positions. So, I mean, I think there can be defences and there can be outside actions that you could say, well, this was to blame or that was to blame. But there's no doubt those are 2 tenures of leadership that have not been good for the DUP.
Well, if I refer you back to my article for The Critic, behind the facade of the Robinson DUP, there was a lot of problems. And essentially, it's when he left that they came out to play. And
and why was that? Was that because there was a weaker leader then that they could come out to play?
No, I would describe it as this: of basically they were always there, and it was fine. I describe it as long as you're succeeding, nobody cares about these things. The minute you run into difficulty, then suddenly they are significant and they are a problem. And also, I would also point out that Arlene was an unexpected leader.
Mm.
You know, the expectation
That's right,
had been Nigel Dodds,
yeah.
and basically at about a week's notice, it was, "Hello, Arlene. How would you like to be the next DUP leader?" You know, so
Yeah,
the expectation had, you know, the common expectation was Nigel would be leader, Arlene would be first minister, do her term as first minister term, and then there would be the potential for the generational change. That was the sort of unwritten thoughts in most people's mind. And that went out a window, and suddenly Arlene found herself in a job. She hadn't had the time to develop a team around her. She hadn't developed her own coterie of MLAs. The nature of the two assembly elections, the first successful assembly election in 2016, she had a new coterie of MLAs who were supportive. The people who lost their seats in the emergency assembly election 2017 were exactly those people. So that those two things are also then what we
I
can for
think
after that.
Okay,
of
Tim,
course,
I'm gonna butt in on you here. This is getting
Okay,
too much
Michael,
of
you
a
can.
confessional between two inside experts. Firstly, you're very welcome, Lee, onto Stormont Sources. The conversation
Thank
so
you.
far has been really interesting, and I can see what my friend Kearns is at here. That all good up to the end of Peter Robson, all good from Gavin Robinson on, and thank heaven some of the people who were around in Peter's successful time are still around to help Gavin Robinson, but and maybe will make themselves more available. First thing I would say about your thing, you've said some interesting things in both the Irish News, and I read that critic piece that you wrote, and it's very interesting about the party, not only strategically but internally, and how all of that operates. And it just struck me that you're being a little harsh on the party. Gavin, I think, has had a really excellent time. I think he's turned in a real 5-star performance. He was at a terrible hand. He had that disaster. I mean, and you said it was pretty big scale yourself. I mean, effectively, they had misled their own supporters about the quality of the agreement that they'd achieved, and like Jim Allister was able to call it lies and all that. And I thought Gavin brought it down to earth pretty well. And I would disagree with you slightly that you're saying it's just keep coming back at you. It's not really dealt with. It's going to come back. And yes, there will be more measures, Brexit-related measures coming down the hill towards us. But I think he has dealt with it pretty successfully. I don't think people are bothered. They've got over the fib. And the election results showed that the DUP, the punishment was you lost the 3 seats. And that was getting your rap on the knuckles from the electorate. But he held all the council seats. And, okay, down a bit in the polls. But I think the DUP is still very strong. And I think Gavin Robinson is in a good position to take it forward.
Oh, the local government elections were before we did the deal. So that's done. It doesn't sustain the evidence. And what was your second point? Oh, memory at 52 is, almost 52 is getting me.
Just that it's not such a big deal going into the future. That Gavin has nearly landed, got you over the hump of it.
Oh, yeah. What I did say in the critic piece is that is one of the DUP's core strengths. All that it has been through, it is still by far the largest unionist party. It does have most of the talent in unionism, so when I wrote that, it was basically, here's 10 things wrong, but there are here 2 or 3 big things which are the basis for rebuilding. And what I would also say is, you talked about how focus on the inside of the party. When you've been inside the party for nearly a decade, you see all the problems that were just allowed to sit and fester and never get dealt with. And then also, I think that's why it is another success of Gavin's, that he actually went, yeah, these are a priority. We have to do things. We have to change things. And that's happened. With the 750 word limit, I would add the caveat that I wasn't able to in the column. Changing structures, changing rules are all there to change a culture. And to change the culture, they need reinforced.
Very, very interesting that you said even change the name. Do you have a name in mind?
Did you? I have. Well, it's not mine. Somebody talked about the Northern Ireland Democrats at a time. That was just one of those things. You're shooting the breeze in the conversation. I don't particularly mind what the word is.
What's
or name is.
What's unsatisfactory about Democratic Unionist Party? It's not a bad.
Because it's been associated with a lot of scandal. It has been associated with strategic fails. Things seriously went wrong in its watch whenever it was leading unionism. That is a problem. There is also, and the bigger thing I think for me is if you look at the electoral shifts of the last decade, the DUP brand is more an historical brand. And the key issue there is if you want to be leading unionism and hopefully leading Northern Ireland, you need a brand which is focused on the future.
So where then, Lee? So obviously we're talking about, because you were saying about Gavin saying about the need now to look outwards, because he's been there a year now, and now we've got 2 years with no elections in front of us. What does that look like? Because Gavin, I suppose the sense about Gavin that I get from him as leader is that the people who know him like him. He's popular in East Belfast. He did see off a challenge when you consider, Gregory Campbell was ran close, Sammy Wilson was ran close, Ian Paisley lost his seat. The Lagan Valley was obviously difficult as well for the party. But Gavin held his majority and was re-elected against a very strong challenge from Naomi Long. So people who know him like him, but again, East Belfast is just one constituency and there are 17 others out there. So how does he translate that out to the other parts of Northern Ireland?
This is one of the challenges he feels because it's what has become consistent from Arlene's time is where the party leader has a stronger and more popular brand than the party actually has. So that's one of the reasons why I have issues with the DUP brand as is. Now, if you want to redefine the brand and still use the DUP over that brand, I don't care. It's the change and evolution that I want to see. I'm not going to die in a ditch over a particular detail one way or the other, but it needs to have a shift. So that was and the way it just...
that shift doesn't need to be branding. I think you actually hit on it in your article, and here's where I agreed with you very strongly. And we've talked about this many times. It's narrative. So the DUP has lost its way on narrative. So in 2003, if you go back to that election, we were part of that campaign. Time for a fair deal. There was a story. You knew what you were voting for. We put out policy documents after policy document after policy document that told a story, a consistent story. This is the way Northern Ireland can be. This is how it will be if you elect the DUP. That's the story. Now, in 2007, that narrative was changed to basically Sinn Féin cannot be the largest party. That has been the narrative, that has been the DUP's election narrative ever since. It is stuck, it is broken, it is dead, it is gone, it needs to be put to the sword. That's the change that needs to happen. It is not a rebrand.
And
they need to find the narrative core.
Tim? Replaced by what?
Well, they need to tell a better story. And the fact is the DUP for now 20 odd years has not told a story. And they need to get back to building that story, that it's not just boogaloo, Sinn Féin's coming for you. That story sustained them for two elections, and they did well with that story and that narrative. But that narrative is gone, and they need to tell a better story for Northern Ireland. I think that's the narrative that sets them apart from the TUV and the Ulster Unionist Party is, what's the better story for Northern Ireland? How can Northern Ireland be better if we make Stormont work? And here's how we're going to make Stormont work. Be brave and put forward proposals for change. Be brave and put forward a different way that we're maybe going to govern this place to make it work better. That's the narrative. I don't know, Lee, if you agree or not.
Broadly, I would say when I'm talking about branding, I'm not just talking about the name. I am also thinking about the values you want to communicate and the narrative. I'm using one term to mean multiple things, but I wouldn't fundamentally disagree with that. I would actually, the way I describe it is the 2016 one was different. There was it was a more hopeful.
Those Arlene's candidates, yeah.
Yeah. So there is a model there that shows it can work. And we have caught ourselves too much in, the voter coalition which kept the DUP dominant is effectively dead. So what's its new vote? It's one of the things I asked. Okay, and it was flogged to death in the 2024 Westminster election. It was what could be squeezed out of it was squeezed out of it.
Okay,
now,
if David
what is the new voter coalition?
Okay, if David will spare the time here, I have a couple of questions. Go back just to the internal proposals in the critic. So there are other quite specific ones about getting rid of the CEO position, changing that to chief of staff, and to have 2 deputy chairs and all of that. What's behind that? That's one question. I know I might get back in, so I'll ask my other question, which is, you've been on the road with Pete Shirlow and reassuring groups of grassroots unionists that the numbers outlook is pretty good, that when you really dig into them, the numbers for the union are quite strong and changing slowly. It occurs to me that while that's definitely true, part of what makes the position of the union really strong is that there are many who would be categorised as nationalists who are not really hardline Green nationalists at all, and who are perfectly comfortable in Northern Ireland. Why don't you have a roadshow for them to show what the DUP or unionism might offer them in a new Northern Ireland that they can buy into completely?
I can deal with all of those. The key thing there on the sort of range of changes, the DUP has experimented with various staffing structures. At one time it said, we'll go with a CEO, that'll solve the problems. It didn't. It's consistently been this thing of where the line's drawn between the party structures and looking after the party and looking after the politics. So that's why I went the line of, no, the leader needs a chief of staff. You do that by getting rid of the director of comms and director of policy and making it chief of staff. You make it in the gift of the leader, and you have a party secretary whose job is to look after and maintain the proper party structures, to spend their time fundraising, not having to run around, put out fires in the system. That shouldn't be their job. So that was that. Again, with the deputy leaders, it was all to drive the decentralisation. There's this massive cult of the leader where everything sort of has to end up on the leader's desk, and there's a lot that ends up on the leader's desk shouldn't be on the leader's desk. So it was all about clearing all that out to create the time and space for the work that needed to be done internally and externally to happen, not just for everybody to be sitting around going, oh, the leader will sort that out, because that wasn't going to work. So that's what drove the process of why I pushed the idea of decentralisation and trying to shift the culture within the DUP of this over-centralisation, which was harming how it was dealing with things. The way I would describe all of these things as regards to the roadshow, we're going around primarily, now these are public events, anybody can come along if they want to come out. They're primarily targeted at unionism because we want to have the discussion with unionism, to point out, here are all these opportunities that we have not fully appreciated and not taken advantage of. You know, we've caught ourselves in this doom cycle and we've missed a bigger picture here. Do you not think it would be better if we moved in the direction of this bigger picture? You know, so and it's showing the good things about Northern Ireland. You know, it's everybody sort of leaves the meeting going, there's lots of good things I've heard about Northern Ireland I've never heard before. Why am I not hearing that? So you get that sense. So it's a bit of that of, the way I describe it, the unionism we have and the unionism we could have. Now, I can't create the unionism we could have from scratch. You know, we have to have a conversation with unionists to show them, that's the unionism you have. This is the one you could have. Doesn't it look better? Doesn't it look more appealing? Shouldn't we consider how we get there? So I use the numbers to show all these opportunities. I then offer a series of rules of how unionism should behave and act to take advantage of those. And then Peter comes in with very much of, here's the positive story of Northern Ireland. It's the thing of it. We are 2 people delivering talks. There's a small group of volunteers behind us. It's being done on a purely voluntary basis. Somebody comes along, gets us a room for free. We come along, do the talks. You know, it's been very organic and very good that way. So that's how it's been operating. Do we see that once we've done the series of 20 talks that's it, we're going to close doors, shut up and go home? Absolutely not. We'll want to carry on the work. The people you describe, I actually talk about in the talk. The way I describe them generally is not yetters. Mm-hmm. And if you know, I don't call them unionists. I call them not yetters. If you they see themselves as Irish, if you ask them sort of their outlook, they'd say they're Irish nationalists, but they're very much the category of, would you vote for abolishing Northern Ireland in a referendum tomorrow? They will go, no. Would you want to see it happen in 20 years? They'll go, yes. So that's why I use the phrase not yet. What's interesting is this bunch of people who are always not yet seems pretty consistent.
But you could
You know,
you could try to move them from being, do you want a united Ireland tomorrow? No. Do you want a united Ireland in 20 years'
yeah.
time? No.
This is the thing about one of the challenges I try and make clear to people is that there's a strategic opportunity here for the pro UK, pro NI position, in that the core critique of Northern Ireland is dead. The core Republican critique of Northern Ireland was someone from a Catholic Nationalist Republic background could never be treated freely in Northern Ireland. It was irreformable. Now, I don't like losing. I never have. I'm not very good at celebrating victories either, but I really hate losing. So I'm not particularly happy we lost to Michelle O'Neill and she is First Minister. But the fact she is, the fact she is proves that the claims made against Northern Ireland for 103, soon to be 104 years, are no longer true. The prime example I also use is Pat Cullen. This is a person who grew up in a Republican village of west of the Rhone. Through her own skills and her own abilities, she was able to get to herself to the top of nursing in Northern Ireland and the top of nursing in the United Kingdom. If the Republican narrative of Northern Ireland was true, none of that could have happened. So Northern Ireland has came on leaps and bounds. I haven't really got this into a slogan yet, but the closest I have got to is we have a massive opportunity right now of making a Northern Ireland of all its talents. And that's, I think, where we need to be going in terms of the broad narrative. Because, it's basically, we do have a broadly equal society in terms of representation, middle class, Catholic middle class is growing, etc. We are in a much better place than we are. Where we go from here is a Northern Ireland of all the talents. I would just, I've forgotten point now. You get interrupted. See, bad memory. You interrupt me and knock me off my
There we
stool.
go. Well. It was just.
Maybe you should call your slogan should be a talented Ulster.
A talented Ulster, yeah. Just in terms, Lee, and we'll wrap up on this because essentially, like we've heard about the thing about obviously, and you referenced this in your piece about making Northern Ireland work, how the DUP engaged with the executive as well, and again, you were quite praising of the performance of the DUP ministers in the executive, Paul Given, Gordon Lyons. You give a special shout out to Emma Little Pengelly as Deputy First Minister. In terms of how they've performed and how they've handled some of those controversial policies, what advice would you give them between now and 2027 in terms of actually some of the banana skins that are potentially there for them between now and then?
We have to shift the conversation. We are going to live in a Northern Ireland society. It's going to be shared and it's going to be negotiated. Nobody's going to get to dictate. And some of the stuff is an attempt to dictate. I would have the issue of the week has been the Grand Central Station signage. I used it this evening. I wish if they were going to spend £150,000, it was so the Wi-Fi works on the enterprise, but we'll leave that aside. And it was great to leave and return to 21st century infrastructure in Northern Ireland and visit what is most definitely not 21st infrastructure in Dublin Connolly Station. But anyway, I've made my little cheap jibe, so I'll move on. This is the thing of they will pick small things to present it as if nothing has changed. And some of those, the way I try and deal with it in the talks is we can't, two things of one, you're not going to stop everything, so pick your fights. Okay? And secondly, what I dislike within the broad aspect of unionism, there's one of the rules of, worry about your own garden. That they're very good, there's too many people around unionism here, very good at telling me what's happening in the garden of nationalism when we've got a fence that needs repaired and weeds that are growing. So it's a case of, if you want to do that, that's fine, but we've our own work to be getting on with. And there's, so that's sort of the twofold of pick your issues and
so
deal with the issues and deal with the
the
issues that need
DUP
tended in your garden.
Do you think the DUP mishandled the Irish language? Because you did reference this in your article. Do you think the DUP mishandled that issue?
I would have done two things. One, I refer to it as a dog whistle. I would have been out up front. I don't think it's any coincidence that the Beltel was trying to get the argument going that the DUP were running rings around Sinn Féin and the executive. Isn't true, but the narrative was out there, and lo and behold, what pops up the next week? Prodding people in the Irish language. I would have actually dealt with it slightly differently. They went on the procedures of the executive. What I would have actually done went with the bad faith. There was an agreement in the NDNA of how we are dealing with culture. There's to be a new Identity and Cultural Expression Unit. There's going to be commissioners for Irish. There's going to be an Ulster British and Ulster Scottish commissioner. We have agreed a mechanism where all these things are going to be examined, discussed, and recommendations given. What essentially this decision is an attempt to skew the pitch. So that's the angle I would have it, that they're undermining what has been agreed. So they are looking as if they're acting in bad faith. So that's how I would have dealt with it, to be perfectly honest.
Okay. Lee, thanks very much for coming on and for discussing
Thanks,
not just your
Lee.
column, but for discussing many more things. So look, it was a really interesting piece. It was in the Irish News on Tuesday for anyone who wants to go and have a read of it. So Lee Reynolds, thank you for coming on Stormont Sources.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Welcome back to Stormont Sources. We're going to move on to our second topic today. We're going to be talking about the tariffs, or not, as they now appear to be, from Donald Trump. He has issued a 90-day reprieve to countries that did not retaliate. But we're going to be looking and talking about the politics of this in Northern Ireland. Tim, I want to start with you, because, I mean, ultimately there is this fear that Northern Ireland, because of our unique situation, will fall between two stools, and that when we get past this, that Northern Ireland might be detrimentally impacted. What do you think about the politics of how the executive responds?
Well, I think the first thing to say is we've fallen victim to Trump's tariffs. I mean, we recorded the best 10 minutes that have ever been recorded in podcast history, which you've had to dump and come back again. This is Thursday morning. Literally last night,
Stormont
the second
Sources
we
gold.
finished recording. Absolutely. And our analysis, Michael, was absolutely spot on. We said, before the tariffs were ditched last night, we said this is all about China. And that's what it's turned out to be. And I think, David, you were the one who said last night, concluded the whole thing by saying this could all be dropped tomorrow. And it was dropped within 10 minutes of you saying that. So, you know, these great 10 minutes of podcast history will never be heard by the nation. And it's a real shame, because I think what we see and what we've seen over the last week or so is an executive that are united on this. We haven't seen anybody turn to the UK, or we haven't seen nationalists turn to the Irish government, because there's not a lot we can do. We're really victims of circumstance in all of this. Whether Trump puts the tariffs back on in 90 days, whether he takes them off as he did last night, we're really victims to what he does and how the EU and the UK retaliate to that. And there's literally nothing that our First Minister or Deputy First Minister could do, other than they could go to the UK government and say, look, if there is something punitive that happens because of an EU decision and the Windsor Framework Protocol, all of those things kick in, is there an easier way, is there a more simple way for businesses here to be able to reclaim those tariffs? Because currently businesses are saying that's a difficult process. So how can those tariffs be reclaimed in a way that's easy and efficient? And that's something our politicians can do. And I'm sure that's what they are doing.
Okay, Michael, what have you made about it? I mean, because obviously there is that fear that on this, and look, Trump is so unpredictable. We could be back here after 90 days with, like, you know, a 30% tariff for all we know. So obviously that does create political issues within the executive about, do we go maybe more toward the European side, or do we stick more with the UK response?
David, far too early for even those considerations to come to the fore. This stuff is above, for the moment, is above the executive's pay grade. This is global stuff. The way Northern Ireland, fortunately, isn't in line to take a direct hit out of any of this, although we do have a small base of US investors in Northern Ireland, and I think the government, the best they can do is get Invest NI out there, show some love, and promise them that this is turbulence and tumult that will go away eventually. And so we're with you for the long haul. On the global stage, I mean, Donald Trump is approaching his Liz Truss moment here. It's one thing that the stock market wobbles up and down, but it's quite another thing when there's a loss of confidence in US paper, US bonds. When investors are, in the stock exchange are saying, well, I don't like the look of that investment, that's bad. But when investors and financiers are saying, I don't have much confidence in this government, And I don't want to lend it money anymore. That is much, much more serious. And Trump would have ploughed ahead from what he's been saying. He was charmed by the countries all queuing up to do bilateral deals and, as he said himself, kiss his rear end. But that's not where his people now are. And he made it clear. And as the US Masters rolls on, Trump uses the golfing terminology of his people having the yips, a rather debilitating nervousness that costs you tournaments. That's where we are. We're in a serious global situation, and Northern Ireland happily can shelter under the UK for the time being.
Can shelter under the UK for time. I mean, I'm just thinking I'm only 36 and I've already been through way too many economic crises in my short life. So thanks, Michael, for kind of just reaffirming that's my come.
You do have to fulfil a Twitter promise that you made, because you promised that we were going to talk about this in the context of the Canadian election.
We are because this is what I'm bringing up. This is what I want to bring it back to, because I think the politics of this are fascinating, right? And more polls have come out showing, for anyone who doesn't know, Canadian Liberal Party, the governing party, were set to get absolutely trounced at the election this year. They were more than 20 points behind. But since Trump came back into office and Mark Carney has come in now as the Canadian Prime Minister, it's reversed. That 20-point Conservative lead has evaporated. The Liberals are now at least 2 points ahead. At most, some polls have them 8 or 9 points ahead. So in some provinces, there's been a turnaround of around about 30 plus points in the polls. And I think that this is where the politics of this come in, because Labour are struggling in the polls. Some polls have them down at 22%. Granted, they've still got time to go on their mandate, but still. And I think if Mark Carney wins this election and wins a majority government, I think there will be pressure on the Irish government and the British government that this is how you win. This is how you do it. Standing up to Trump, which is what Mark Carney is seen as the option is doing, that's how you win elections. And I think particularly for Labour, in particular on the left, that will be where Keir Starmer will be counselled to go. Tim, what do you think of that?
I don't quite agree with that analysis, David. I think if I was Keir Starmer, I would wait and see, because the Liberal bounce isn't at the expense of the Tories. So it's not the Canadian Conservatives that are going down in the poll. They're staying pretty constant in the high 30s, 36, 37, 38%, something in that range. It's the NDP, it's the far left in Canadian politics that have collapsed, and those people have moved to the Liberal Party. Now, the NDP has completely collapsed from sort of around 20% of the vote. Some polls have them in as low as 5%. They'll probably not be that low whenever it comes to election day. They'll probably be a little higher than that. So I think most leaders look at that and say, that's interesting. Mark Carney came in, and I think there's more to the Mark Carney story than just he stood up to Trump. The Canadian people were tired of Trudeau, and Carney came in, and even though he was Trudeau's economic advisor, he's been successful in distancing himself from Trudeau and saying, look, I'm the statesman who's come to the party, and I'm going to be able to stand up to Trump. I know economics more than anybody else, more than Donald Trump, and I'm the guy you can back on that. And I think the Conservatives have run a very bad election campaign as well. So I think there's a lot more going on than just a simple narrative of Carney's been tough, Carney's won an election, Keir Starmer needs to be tough, Keir Starmer will get a bounce in the polls. And don't forget, Keir Starmer's got quite a few years left in the tank before he has to go to an election. And I think for him that's going to be problematic is internal problems that he might face that would maybe be a challenge to his leadership internally. Yeah. But I think he's not where Carney is.
I'll give you Canadian anoraks in my 10 cents, and it's simply that Carney's adopted this anti-Trump stance to get elected. I think when he is elected, he will go back to being the debonair international financier and the right type of person to have in that job, and he will try and make things work. Keir Starmer will probably follow that lead, and Ireland in particular will not adopt an anti-Trump aggressive stance. There's too much to lose. Ireland will want a bilateral deal that protects them from the absolute economic disaster that would be the loss of the US pharmaceutical industry in Ireland.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that obviously with the original Trump tariffs, and even though the reprieve has come in, it was that pharmaceuticals were kind of left out of that. And we've talked before about obviously the Irish budget has been very much predicated on Irish pharmaceuticals and American FDI. Tim, do you think that obviously, sometimes when the Republic sneezes, Northern Ireland catches the economic cold? I mean, should the executive be worried about maybe a broadside that could be coming against the Irish government, which could have maybe some ripple effects over into Northern Ireland?
I'll actually turn this back on you two guys. I mean, are you worried? Because David, we've talked many times in the pub about, Ireland's 23 million euro surplus.
Billion.
13 billion surplus, sorry. 13 billion of that is Apple. And you tell me in the pub, you say, why don't you join the third richest country in the world? Why would you not, want to join that? It's big surpluses. You're going to succeed. And I think for that narrative, and certainly the Irish unification conversations have been built on that. Ireland's successful. Why would you not want to join success? Does the conversation need to change? Is there a little nervousness now? This Apple money could be going back to California?
No, I don't. I'll tell you for the reason why. First of all, the budget surplus was definitely inflated by the Apple decision. It'd be foolish not to say that. But Ireland was tracking toward a budget surplus anyway before this. Number one. And number two is that, look, Simon Harris, the Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach have referenced the fact that, look, if this does happen, it will have budgetary pressures on the Irish budget. There's no point denying that it won't. But I think in terms of actually the broader economic picture, you can't just uproot and move a pharmaceutical firm. In fact, actually, some of the pharmaceutical companies, if they were even to go back, many of them wouldn't be able to relocate until after Donald Trump has left as president. It takes years to relocate those firms back, and I think that's one of the big things that Ireland has in their way. And I know Michael has said before about the two-way traffic as well. So
no, the biggest worry for the Northern Ireland economy out of all of this is the UK going into recession. Because even things are really bad, Labour are stretching every muscle, pulling at any lever they can to try and generate some growth, and it's not there. I personally believe the UK economy is in underlying recession as a result of Brexit, because there's just slowly, thousands and thousands of little investment decisions are being taken, and they're going the wrong way. And the UK is losing out. And if it gets hit by heavy tariffs, particularly to its car industry, that could send the UK into recession. And if London's got no money, that's bad news for us.
Well, for our
I think we better let producer Paul get this uploaded before Trump puts more tariffs on, so we better stop, I think.
Well.
Get it out in 5 minutes.
I think Lee, I think Lee and Tim relitigated Brexit pretty well earlier on in the podcast, so it doesn't seem like it seems like there's no surrender from the Brexiteer forces. Just one last question before we wrap it up. Obviously, there's talk about the second state visit from President Trump. Obviously, in Northern Ireland, that's going to create some issues because the DUP, of course, are very happy to have Donald Trump here. But then Michelle O'Neill and the Alliance Party, the ministers will run a million miles in the opposite direction. I know, Michael, I'm going to go to you on this just for a quick response. You're a big golfer. I know they're apparently, I'm told there are good golf courses up the North Coast. But tell me, do you think that if he does come to Northern Ireland, that could create some political pressures, and how should the parties play that?
I think when Trump comes over, they should roll out the red carpet. He is a guy with a massive ego, so the more they play to it, the better their relationship will be. If you can get him over here up to the Gulf, all to the good. I have to say, the state visit that focused my attention the last few days was His Majesty's visit to Italy. And a delight to see him spend his 20th wedding anniversary along with Camilla in the company of the Pope in Rome.
Brilliant.
Was a wag on Twitter who commented, it's good to see a member of the Church of Scotland drop in to see how well the Pope's recovering. Thought that was quite a good line. But I think, undoubtedly, we've got an offering for Trump here if he was to come and play golf. And obviously, Stormont Sources, we could get Trump on. Maybe go, the three of us, he could make up a 4-ball and we could go round Royal Portrush with him and do a live special. But, seriously, I do think that, if he was to come here, there is things in Northern Ireland that we can offer Trump that I think he would be particularly keen on. I mean, I know Emma Pengelly gave him the Royal Portrush flag. And, Donald Trump says that people are getting the yips over the markets. I think all we can say is let's hope that Rory McIlroy this weekend doesn't get the yips like he did at the US Open last year, and let's hopefully he wins. And his daughter Poppy, who put in that 25-foot putt last night, hopefully she's shown the way of how Rory McIlroy can win the Masters this weekend.
There's nothing but upside here. Stormont Sources
I'll have
might
to-
change the course of global economics.
What do you think? What do you think, David? Who's going to win the Masters?
I'll have to wait for you back in the clubhouse because I have no idea about golf or any other sport. Anyway, look, folks, we'll wrap it up there. So just to remind you that if you want to get in touch with us, we are going to do a Ask Tim, Michael and David Anything episode in the near future. So do keep sending in your emails, hello@stormontsources.com. Also drop us a WhatsApp voice note or a message, 0333 404 6507. Remember to use the word Stormont so we know it's for this podcast. That's all we have time for this edition of Stormont Sources. Thank you for listening in. Please, once again, do keep those ideas, questions and comments coming. That's all from Tim, Michael and myself. We'll see you next week.